This spotlight edition of Democratic Visions begins in East Africa. Earlier this year, students and school officials in Kifungilo, Tanzania, welcomed author Maria Nhambu and her friends Catherine Mamer and Jackie Mosio with dance and music. The Minnesotans were returning to Kifungilo to mark the completion of Maria Nhambu's memoir, the Dancing Soul Trilogy. The Kifungilo area was Maria Nhambu's childhood home.
She had come back from a trip to Africa, and she said, now's the time to start writing the book. This is about 25 years ago.
She wanted to celebrate that she had finished this trilogy of books, and she would like to introduce them in Tanzania. But it was really, I finished, I want to go back and celebrate. And then she said, well, I really want you to come back with me because it's going to be your 80th birthday. And Jackie, my best friend and editor, I want her to be a part of it. And so the three of us trucked off to Tanzania.
Nhambu, Catherine, and Jackie's East Africa safari to Kifungilo took off in January. Africa's Child, America's Daughter, and Drumbeats Heartbeats essay a life that began in colonial Tanganyika and moved to Minnesota in the 1960s, to an America coming to grips with its fractured promise. The Kifungilo complex is nested high among the villages and forests of the Usambara Mountains. Back in the 1940s, it was the remote setting of a home for children of mixed race, run by an order of Catholic nuns. Some of the children were orphans. Nhambu was one of them, an orphan named Mary.
But I was brought in Kifungilo when I was 3 days old. You know, around that time, there was an order of nuns, Catholic nuns from Germany called the Precious Blood Sisters, who felt sorry for the plight of the mixed-race children.
The sisters also ran a primary school and strictly oversaw religious instruction. In Africa's Child, Nhambu writes of the bullying, shaming, and mistreatment at Kifungilo, but also of the education, care, friendships, and hope for the mixed-race girls.
I mean, Kifungilo was an orphanage, but at least we were wanted there. It was our place.
They were better off than the mixed-race children without such a home. She speaks of these so-called outcasts and their mothers.
They were also ostracized for having a mixed child. So very often, if they chose to raise us, they took us to the village and hid us. Some of us could live and die and never see the sun or the wind, feel the rain. I was so lucky I wasn't one of those, but I know there were many.
Not knowing who her birth parents were, young Mary felt free to change her name. During high school, she called herself Mary Rose Ryan. That's when she met Catherine Murray, an American teacher from Minnesota. Kathy Murray adopted Mary Rose Ryan and helped her get into St. Catherine College in St. Paul. 2 Irish Colleens at St. Kate's. More name changes were to come, beginning when she married and raised a family on Lake Cornelia in Edina, a Minneapolis suburb, and became an educator, a collector of African art, and an internationally popular aerobics choreographer.
Raise your arms, turn your
Her workouts and videos are based on and infused with African music, dance, and fun.
if you can, stretch.
Nhambu's infatuation with African dance began on the sly when she was young Mary at Kifungilo.
We were put to sleep, you know, like about 6 o'clock, and it got dark also at that time. And then we would hear the drumming of the villagers, the Wasamba tribe. And these drums would just call me. I would sit in my little bed and I would just wish I would be dancing. When the nun turned the one little light off, and I would sneak down into the villages and I would dance with the Africans, because I just loved the way they danced, and we were forbidden to dance like the Africans. Sure. They told us if we really wanted to learn to dance, we should learn the German waltz, which is what they taught us when we were children. I am 75 years old. Many people spend a lifetime trying to forget pain, abuse, trauma. You can't will things away. You're just deceiving yourself, and you do not live you don't live a life that is authentic.
Maria Nhambu has become a voice for women who may have lost hope for a better life. For women who have been abused and thwarted by racist, economic, and gender bias. Women who, like herself, have had to survive depression or divorce and move forward.
I think one of her strongest messages is to be who you are and to love who you are. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what she told the girls at Kifungilo School.
We have 3 visitors from America, but Maria was brought to
Kifungilo was one of the trio's 4 safari destinations. They had also arranged Meet the Author talks at a bookstore in coastal Dar es Salaam, the Arusha Cultural Heritage Center near Mount Kilimanjaro, and Tarangire Safari Lodge in Tarangire National Park. At each stop, Nhambu spoke of her life journey, of struggle and recovery.
You know, people say to me, why did you decide to write this story? I never decided to write this story. The story wanted to be written. It chose me. There were all these children in the orphanage whose story nobody knew. But the story wanted to be told, and I think I'm the first one who has really told it.
Jackie and Catherine shared more of their mutual story with producer Jeff Strait.
Maria Nhambu was a young girl when you adopted her.
Well, I met her when I was teaching in 1962 in Morogoro, East Africa, which was then Tanganyika.
Was Tanganyika, yeah.
For the Maryknoll sisters. I was 23.
23, and Maria was what, 19, 20?
Well, she was 18 when I first met her, but she was 19 by the time I took her to the States.
And that got her to St. Paul?
That got her to St. Paul, to St. Catherine's College. College of St. Catherine, now St. Catherine's University.
Now, Jackie, you're the editor of this trilogy, this wonderful trilogy. Tell us about it.
First of all, I have to say that it's just been the most amazing experience for me, and a real privilege, because her story is so powerful, and there's so many parts to it, and there's so many things that are relevant.
The first book carries through high school, correct?
Yes.
And the second book?
America's Daughter begins with Nhambu and Kathy flying to the United States, to Minnesota, attend St. Catherine's, and she has to deal with a whole new culture, language. She has especially to learn how to be a Black American, because she realizes quickly that that's how everybody sees her. And that's one of the main points of her book.
But she's not an African American yet.
She's not an African American, but she is African. That would be in the 60s.
In the 60s, when things were not exactly peaceful in this country.
Exactly.
And tell us about the third book.
The third book is Drum Beats, Heartbeats, where her entire story and the story of her origins comes to a closure.
Because she never knew her birth mother or birth father.
She had no idea.
Right. It's quite a walloping story, that third book.
Indeed.
So we're not going to divulge what goes on.
We don't want to tell the story.
That's right. Catherine, what is the arc of the trilogy? What are people going to get out of the whole thing?
Well, this is a story that is a very personal story, a very revealing story. It's the story of a life that is lived in an orphanage where she's very much mistreated, and where she always has hope. And that's, I think, the prevailing point of the story, is that there is always hope.
Okay. When I was little, I was called Fat Mary because I was fat. I ate anything I saw.
A big part of her story is a person who is kind of her soul that becomes her friend. And she names her Fat Mary, the despicable name that people call her.
I'll be walking along someplace, I see a banana peel full of sand and whatever, I throw away the soul and eat it. I just ate whatever and anything. It was my comfort. And so I was fat, so they all called me Fat Mary. And I hated that name. I just absolutely hated Fat Mary. And I used to cry when they called me Fat Mary.
Not a real friend in flesh and blood,
right.
But a soul friend.
A soul friend. And she would say that this is not some imaginary friend or a pretend friend.
I took the absolutely detested name of Fat Mary, and I turned her into my friend, my beloved friend, who was me, who was my twin. And I talked to her about everything.
And she also uses Fat Mary to reveal her better judgment at times, her thoughts.
So Fat Mary she's so important in my life. She's important today. She was my counselor and my consoler. I told her about the heavy stuff I was carrying, and she counseled me. So I talked to Fat Mary. She's very, very important in all the 3 books that I have.
The whole concept of reaching into yourself and bringing something forth that's going to help you is really powerful in her book. And the other real resource for her was dance, and she emphasizes that quite a bit. And she kept that with her entire life, and it really sustained her. She loved dancing.
Even in St. Paul?
Well, she started out demonstrating maybe to her classes sometimes. She was teaching African studies, and then realized that people, young audiences would be a perfect venue for her to share with the kids at school.
Mm-hmm. Was this high school? Or?
That would be grade school. Young Audience was a program, it still exists, where they take people, whether musicians or dancers or whatever, they take them to the schools and they perform for them.
Catherine, what challenges did Nhambu have during her early years in Minnesota?
This is sometimes when I feel very bad that I wasn't more aware of what was going on in her life. There were so many challenges with, being alone, being not knowing about the U.S. and how things were. Originally, we had a very hard time finding a place to live.
Why?
Because she was black. I didn't anticipate this. I wasn't aware that I was going to have that kind of problem. And so I actually had people that said, well, she looks like a lovely girl, but she's very beautiful, and there'll be black men hanging around. And of course, in this day and age, you couldn't say that kind of thing.
That's in 1960s.
This is in 1963.
63. Okay.
Right. Another big challenge was, along with about the racism, was that I wholeheartedly supported her going on this Ambassadors for Friendship mission, and they went into the Deep South, and it was a terrible experience for her.
I remember the first time somebody told me I was black. I actually went into a mirror. I looked at myself, and I absolutely did not see a black person. I saw me, So I had to learn to become black and all of this stuff. And I have many, many, many black, wonderful friends, and they all consider me black. And I still, right now, if I have to say my race, whatever I'd say, of course, I identify as a black person because kind of that is what I am in America. But although it was not really ingrained in me the way it is over there. So
it was amazing that she was able to give this talk at the Cultural Heritage Center in Arusha. It's a place that she's loved and known about for ever since it began in the 2000s, and friends of hers are the owners. It's filled with African art, which is another one of her great loves.
I heard also when you were there, they showed a segment of Democratic Visions.
No, the whole thing.
The whole thing, the full
yes,
half hour.
Was on a loop, and it was shown at a
loop
couple
too.
places.
So we're on a loop in East Africa, in the shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro, in Arusha, in this fabulous museum dedicated to African art and culture.
And there you are.
Yeah, there I am on a monitor. Great, good. I would have liked to have been with you in person, but you know, I had to shovel snow or something like that back home.
In a past life, like Catherine, I was also a teacher in East Africa, Uganda in my case, Tanganyika for Kathy.
I went to teach for the Maria Nhambu sisters in a program called Teachers for East Africa.
I was with the Peace Corps, and I know what Nhambu, Kathy, and Jackie know. Reconnecting with long-lost friends can be really meaningful. And that's what they did in Tanzania, reconnecting.
And another friend, Thekla, who Kathy knows from...
Who I taught.
She was a student of Kathy's.
At Marian College in Morogoro, where I taught both of them.
She came to the Cultural Heritage Center, and probably the biggest one of all, Africa's Child begins with Nhambu talking about her friend Elizabeth, who was her best childhood friend at the orphanage.
At the orphanage.
At the
okay.
orphanage, yes.
So it's been a long time.
Well, they grew up together at the orphanage, and then when Nhambu went away to school, she came back, age 13, and Elizabeth had run away, and she never heard of her again. When she'd ask on her later visits to Africa, they said, "Oh, Elizabeth died." Well, it turns out that her son was reading a portion of Nhambu's book online and said, "Wait a minute, that sounds like my mother." And he contacted Nhambu on Facebook. The famous Elizabeth from the first part of the book. And the most interesting thing is she is exactly as Nhambu describes her. And they also talked about some of the same things, you know. What's so rewarding for me as an editor is to realize that she's absolutely reflecting the reality that she grew up in, because all the other people around her that we met reflected the same thing. So it's 100% accurate.
Tell us about that time when Nhambu decided to write a book.
Well, she had come back from a trip to Africa, and she said, now's the time to start writing the book. This is about 25 years ago. And she began, and she would send me the manuscripts. I was in New York going to Columbia University getting a degree in writing, and she would ask me my opinion about them. She had other people advising her as well. It's really been that long of a project, 25 years in doing it. And then in 2012, she began finalizing the manuscript.
We have a trilogy. I think it's relevant to a lot of things going on today. What message is Nhambu leaving for younger generations?
Well, I think there's so many things that she addresses that happen in her life. One of the really impressive things when you hear her talk is when she talks about her divorce. And she talks about how everybody comes to celebrate when you get married, but they disappear when you get divorced. Now, I have watched audiences all over while she has talked about that, and there are tears, and there are people who come and say, "Thank you so much for saying that. Thank you so much for making us realize that we can take divorce into the open. It isn't just something that has to be buried under the rug." The other thing that she talks about is her bout with breast cancer. And this is another thing that we have so many examples of going on all over. And people don't often talk about their struggles with that. And she brings it all out. I mean, a friend called me the other night from California, and she said, I think sometimes she reveals a little too much. And I said, so do I.
And Jackie?
Love yourselves. And that's been one of her strongest and most positive messages, and really that's how she has survived, by learning to accept and love herself as who she is. And that's really the only gift we can give to our society, is being who we are, being the best self that we can be in our times, in these times.
I think the other message here is that if this girl from this terrible background that she came from can make it, can't we all? Can't we all? Maybe she had some lucky breaks, but it was she who was right there fighting all the time. I have to get an education. I have to be hopeful. I have to be engaged in my life, and I have to love myself.
Catherine, Jackie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
The Dancing Soul Trilogy reveals the poignant life journey of a woman with roots in East Africa who took on the surname Nhambu. Jackie, Catherine, and Nhambu can be contacted at marianhambu.com. Each can also be reached via Facebook. Democratic Visions is handcrafted by volunteers from Eden Prairie, Hopkins, Edina, Minnetonka, and Bloomington. Watch us on select cable systems and on our YouTube channel. This is Carol Sundstrom.